Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LocoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LocoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com. All right, and we are back once again with Coach Karina.
Hey guys.
And today is going to be all about carb metabolism, which Karina's like foaming at the mouth to talk about. So just kidding. But she was just at the ISSN conference, which is the International Society of Sports Nutrition. So it's a really well recognized sports nutrition organization, and then also they have a yearly conference.
They have a journal.
Yes, they have a journal.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll have some good news about that, which I'll share soon.
Okay.
But no, they have they have a really...
I'm putting dots together in the middle of the podcast.
They have a really great journal, which is open access. So if you do, and they have some position stands as well you know, like they have a really great one on like creatine and like
nutrient timing.
Yeah, like all those types of things. So if you're interested in, you know, sometimes it's hard to read through individual studies and know like, is this a good study? Is it a bad study? You know, so the reviews can be really nice because they've pooled a bunch of literature and they've taken out the most important things.
And they're pretty easy to digest.
I would say they're pretty easy.
Yeah, they're
to
not
read.
super easy, but they are much easier than
an individual paper or 10
going through
papers.
a stats question or stats section.
Yeah, they break it down very nicely. So Karina was just there and she was like, I'm so excited to talk about carbs. So if you guys have seen Wolf of Wall Street, like that one scene where he like grabs the mic and he's like losing it. Like I was sending her that. I was like, this is gonna be you tomorrow. Talking about this.
I will do my best. I am functioning on like literally an hour and a half of sleep because we were at the conference and and I'm sure a lot of people can relate, I do not sleep well not in my own bed. And so the last 3 nights I've been rooming.
Well, and you were at an Airbnb.
Yeah, I was rooming with, you know, a previous student and I love her to death. She was awesome. She presented at the conference, but man, like I do not sleep well if it's not in my own bed.
Yeah, well,
super high maintenance.
Especially at I mean, I've stayed in Airbnbs and I mean, it really depends on the one, but you can feel very uncomfortable in them.
Ours was like in the middle of downtown.
Yeah.
Like, I was like,
super thin walls, really loud. I swear to God, one fucking time. So everybody knows me, like I don't do horror movies. Like I just don't. And I like have I get...
Or is this the one that you stayed with Dr. Joe?
Yes. So I have like really, really bad like anxiety, like almost panic attacks based around seeing certain things. My imagination is weird. Anyways, I'm all fucked up. Different podcast, but I'm not gonna psychoanalyze that right now. Yeah, we're not gonna
say that one for Rick. The deeper issues.
Yes, deeper issues. But so one time I was staying at this place with Paul and Dr. Joe, and when I tell you, first of all, this place was 100% haunted, okay?
Out of a horror movie. And I normally will not go to Airbnbs by myself because I, you know, just... Did you guys read the reviews of this place before you went?
Listen. So backstory. Normally we were on a whole stint where the 3 of us were traveling a lot together, and Paul will pick the most abysmal places to stay because he won't look into it. So I said, I'm taking hold of this. The next 2 trips we go on, I'm going to book the Airbnbs, all right? Look it up. Location seems good. It's close to the venue. The photos look really nice.
And they catfished you.
Total catfish. So I'm driving with the Uber driver, and again, normally I don't go to these places by myself because you just never know.
Yeah.
But I had some clients. They were going to be there like within the hour. So I was like, you know what? Okay, I'm just going to go drop myself off. And so I get there and I'm like, is this not gonna hurt? And the guy's like, it's not bad. I'm like, oh great. So I get up there and like, to get the door open, first of all, was like already like, this is the start of a horror film. And we go upstairs. It's like one of those like split level things because we're in Pittsburgh, so it's a little bit different. But like, so you walk in and then you go up the stairs. Literally, I go up the stairs. The first thing I see is like this fucking grotesque doll, and it's like it's like horror, like, you know, haunted tours and like all this. I'm like, why are these pamphlets out? I don't want to see this. And I just walked in and I had this like eerie feeling of like, oh my God, this place is... So I wouldn't go upstairs. I was like, I'm not going upstairs by myself. I'm going to sit here until I get here. And I was like, Kat, where are you guys? I was like, oh my God. And I'm just like trying to busy myself in the kitchen. Like, okay, I'm going to pick up yawn. And I'm like losing my mind. And old houses, they're obviously, especially up north, like really creaky, you know? So like every time I hear something, it just, you know. And
that's how my Airbnb was. So part of the reason why I didn't sleep is because like, I was waking up every morning or every hour, like thinking that I heard footsteps like coming up our stairs because we were split level as well, and I was like, goes there.
And then so for the decor, which I totally did not realize because the photo looked really nice, over the couch was like a fucking shovel. I'm not kidding. It was not like it was like a decorative shovel, but I'm like, okay, bury the bodies. It was like a shovel.
There was dirt
like,
on it.
It was just so awful. Anyways, so that night, so like I said, it was kind of like one of those split level places. So we had like the person like underneath us or whatever. And the walls must have been, you know, hella paper thin. And they had to be watching like some type of horror film. And it was like on full blast. Both nights. Why are you watching a horror film at 3 a.m, 2 nights in a row? Okay? You maybe have other problems. And I was like, oh my God, I couldn't sleep. I was like losing my mind over this thing. So I totally know what you mean about like bad Airbnb experience. Like if I'm by myself, like I won't even book one now. I'm just like, no. I've been also catfished way too many times. Like they used to be so good when they started. It was such a great thing. And then they just
I've had some great Airbnb
me too, but some not so great ones. Anyways,
I'm gonna do my best to be as
articulate
as possible, and then Lauren's gonna, you know, put the team on her back anytime I'm like struggling over here. So so if you have not listened to the previous podcast, we covered protein metabolism, we covered fat metabolism. We were like, what should be our next podcast? And I was like, well, we can't leave out everyone's favorite macro. So I like to, you know, well, we've already kind of had a fun start, but what is your favorite carbohydrate of all time?
Like just a pure carbohydrate?
Just a pure carb. So maybe a carb that you eat
potatoes
most often. Potatoes. Okay.
I'm team potatoes. Like so Irish, but I love potatoes. How many ways can you cook potato? I mean,
a lot of ways.
And French fries. Can also cook it without, like, you obviously like fries or whatever. Like that's great. They added fat, but like even just regular potatoes, like I love.
So not sweet potatoes, like white potatoes.
Yes, or you know, I mean, actually,
if you had to pick one.
Honestly, probably very specific, but like the tiny
honey gold.
Yeah, like those tiny ones with like the skin on them. Okay, those are my favorite. I've been crushing those in the air fryer. Like we like coat it in like salt and pepper and garlic.
Honey gold potatoes sliced up in the air fryer is like, I ate that on prep so many times because it's like super like very volume macro friendly as well.
Yes. Potatoes are very volume friendly. Most people would think like, oh, potatoes are so unhealthy. It's like, yeah, if you're eating fucking French fries, you know what I mean? But if you're having like just roasted potatoes, hash browns, if you just get like the shredded potatoes and you cook those, again, super prep friendly, or just in general, if you're trying to like, you know, be conscious of how many carbs you're eating, you can get a good amount of those. And also I've been on a mango kick. I told you, I literally like when I'm home.
I got to eat a mango at your house.
I'll
buy one on the way.
I literally cannot stop eating mangoes. Like I don't know why now at this point in my life.
Especially in the summer. Also, fun fact about potatoes, they are like crazy high in potassium.
Yes.
Like higher than bananas, avocados.
We actually like using those in peak week with people for that reason. If they can, some people can't tolerate potatoes very well. Like it just kind of depends on your digestion. But if you can, that was a little hack that Cliff taught me, because we obviously are paying a lot of attention to sodium, but also like making sure that you are getting that in there. The potatoes for the potassium. And again, most people tolerate potatoes. Some don't, so we have to ask, like, if you're like, oh, my body doesn't digest potatoes well, okay, well, don't have those. But for the most part, I would say that most people can tolerate that. And then obviously, I mean, like jasmine rice is like a go-to, like a sticky rice, whatever you want to call it. But
I was gonna say mine is
definitely
obviously because I'm Spanish and then like probably have some Asian genetics. Rice, like I could eat a bathtub of rice. It's disgusting. Like I could just eat rice
fresh out of the rice cooker.
Yeah. Like Lauren and Ryan always have like rice cooking all the time because Ryan probably eats a rice cooker full of rice every day. So I usually when I walk in their house, they have like rice cooking and it always smells so good.
Always 24/7 because
jasmine rice.
Princess Ryan likes fresh rice. So like, God forbid we have to reheat it. Like he is all about that fresh rice. But you know what I found? So we were making like yellow rice. Sorry, we're like so off. Whatever.
We'll get there eventually.
We'll get the carbs eventually. Not just eating them.
Yeah.
So the yellow rice, like fucking what's that company that makes yellow rice? It's really good.
Goya.
Is it Goya or Vigo or whatever? One of those places, right?
Yeah.
But the yellow rice. So we got it one day, and I used to eat that like growing up, and we made it, and it's so good. Right? Super salted, obviously, like seasoned, the whole deal. And what I realized is that because again we make rice every day, So I know when it like crusts over faster than like other, like it gets like really dry. And I was like, why does the yellow rice always get really, really, like you have to take it out. If you don't eat it in that day, you have to take it out. Otherwise it's basically like just ruined. And I was like, that's so weird. And then we started putting the times that we would put salt in the regular rice, it would do the same thing. So I was like, oh, it must be the salt. So like if you do salt your rice, you can't really leave the rice overnight. Like it gets really, really hard. And then you just kind of find yourself wasting the rice. And I couldn't figure it out. I was like, what?
The water out.
I was like, what the fuck is with the yellow rice?
Yeah, but I love salt in my rice.
I know. I know it does taste really good when it's salted previously, but fun facts.
Okay, now we'll move into
Anonymous.
Now we'll move into carbohydrate metabolism. So how I wanted to set this up was basically just kind of talk about foundational carbohydrate metabolism, go over some of the language that we mention a lot in other podcasts, like blood glucose, glycogen, all those things, and then go into more of like the practical application. So follow up how we manipulate and utilize our knowledge on carb metabolism for physique athletes and trying to change body composition, and then follow that up with performance athletes, because it's a very different use for both. So to start out, I thought it would be important to lay out the types of carbohydrates there are three main types: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides are going to be your most simple carb. And when we talk about blood glucose, glucose is a monosaccharide. And it's essential for energy source for nerve cells, red blood cells, brain cells, etc. It's pretty much your body's primary source for fuel and energy. There's also fructose, also known as sugar from fruits, and then galactose, which is typically found in just a few foods. It's not as common of a sugar. And then there's disaccharides, which are pretty much pairs of monosaccharides. So two types of monosaccharides together, and then that's where you might see maltose, sucrose, and lactose. And then there's polysaccharides, which include glycogen, starch, and fibers. So glycogen is a storage form of the monosaccharide glucose. So you probably heard the term muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, and we'll talk about what that means. And then starch is also a storage form of carbs, but mainly in plants. And so you'll often see on certain ingredients list amylopectin and amylose. That is a starch. And then we have our general fibers, which are typically the structural parts of like plants and things like that. We recommend not a super high fiber diet, but a moderate fiber diet, because you definitely go off the rails with fiber. I actually went to the ER once because I was like constipated for 3 days because I had too much fiber.
Just like broccoli growing in your stomach.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Wasn't it broccoli?
I don't know. It was a lot of roughage
Okay.
that I was eating, and I like didn't go to the bathroom for like 3 days, and it got to a point where I was in so much pain that I actually thought it was appendicitis. So it was like 2 a.m, and my dad was like, "You need to go to the hospital right now." And I hate the hospital, and I was like, "No, like I'll be okay." And I was like crying. He's like, "If you don't go right now, like I'm calling the cops to come to your house and take you." And
Baker at you.
Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah, you could definitely. So we can also talk about when we talk about the coaching.
Your dad would say that.
My dad is. My dad is a interesting person. So I love you, Dad. But anyway, so
as he's eating jelly out of the
we'll talk about like fiber prescription when we dive into like the physique application. But I just kind of want to lay down.
Dude, I had somebody tell a client to eat 100 grams of fiber, and I was like, no. And this is somebody who's very regular, and I was like, no.
Oh my
like,
gosh.
That is like a one-way ticket to death.
How many calories were they eating?
A normal amount, not like
that's too much.
So much. So unnecessary.
So, a fun fact with glycogen, which I typically have to communicate with clients when, say, for example, they have an untracked meal and their weight jumps up like 4 or 5 pounds, is glycogen is always stored with approximately 3 grams of water as well. And so typically when you are starting a diet and you cut out carbs, sometimes people will lose like 5-6 pounds in that week. It's mostly water. For the most part. Some of it can actually be body fat. Dr. Campbell's research that he presented this weekend showed that very elegantly. But then also just something, if you're someone who sees fluctuations like that on the scale, and it's typically after a high carb meal. Just know that it's likely mostly water because the storage form of glucose, carbohydrate, glycogen is always stored with an extra 3 grams of water. And then following up with that, the 2 major sites of glycogen storage in the body are the liver and the skeletal muscle, which is why we love doing carbs before we train, right? Because that's how we get that full like muscle belly and that nice pump. So we'll talk more about that when we get into performance athletes and things like that. So kind of already talked about fibers, but the reason we like to have fibers is because, well, maybe from like a dieting standpoint, is because it's very satiating, also very good for your gut health. Fibers are largely not digested, so they slow down digestion, which is why they make you feel fuller longer, and they delay gastric emptying. Some fun health effects of starches and fibers, because I feel like in today's world, especially with like the, maybe mainstream keto stuff, it's like carbs are bad, sugar is bad. Starches and fibers can improve cholesterol, help control blood glucose, improve digestion, prevent colon cancer, and manage weight through satiety, because you're going to be eating less if you have a higher fiber diet and a moderate starch diet. And so then I wanted to talk about maintaining blood glucose and essentially how carbs play into affecting blood glucose. So maybe since I've been talking, I feel like forever you can talk about. I mean, I don't know. I like usually we have like a nice.
I know. Well, you were on a roll. I wasn't trying to like.
Yeah,
mess
I kind
it
of
up.
want to get through like the boring educational stuff and then like really get to the application stuff. So, blood glucose. Every time you consume carbohydrates, that glucose goes into the bloodstream. Elevated glucose in the bloodstream signals to the pancreas, hey, release some insulin. That insulin like runs out to go pick up the glucose, and then it like picks it up and it transports it to the muscle and the liver, which is where we talked about that storage glycogen to give you that nice pump. And then glycogen in the liver is kind of like that reserve. So when you are training and you're contracting your muscles, you're utilizing that muscle glycogen, and then that liver is kind of like, okay, I'm getting low blood glucose. Then that liver will release that extra glycogen. Our body is very resilient, very cool that way. And then also fun fact, after a 12-hour fast, so like say you fast overnight, I'm gonna ask you this question.
Hopefully. Wake up and eat. You're like,
yeah. So
starving.
How much do you think glycogen levels are depleted after a large carbohydrate meal, and you just sleep all night and you wake up the next morning? How much do you think glycogen levels are depleted?
Muscle glycogen?
Yes.
30%?
Mm-hmm. So that's pretty close. Oh. It's a very small percent. Okay. It's like 20%. So
okay.
Yeah. So which is.
I was like, God, I fucking hate being put on the spot. Are we really doing this right now? Like,
no. Well, I literally just took the class, so I'm like very fresh out of the text,
but you know,
textbook. So yeah, so what I typically tell clients, for example, who have to train fasted, is have a large carbohydrate meal at night. Those muscle glycogen stores are still going to be pretty full. You don't need to like slam like 50 grams of oats at 4 a.m. if you don't want to. Muscle.
Obviously,
glycogen.
if you're dieting,
different. Yeah. So your glycogen stores are going to still be pretty full. I thought that was a fun fact.
And that's really practical because a lot of people do have to train in the morning just based on their life. Now, obviously, from a performance perspective, it's not going to be optimal for performance. So if you are training to be the best athlete in X sport, is that the most optimal? No. But for most people who are training, who maybe have other things in their life that take priority, are there ways that we can augment that and kind of offset the issues? Certainly. You can have a large meal before bed, and then you can have some intra-workout carbs, right? Like 2 easy ways, like, hey, I can't eat, but I am focused on my performance. Easy. There's always kind of like a give and take. And you have to understand, like, where are you at in your life and your goals, and like, what are you doing? Because optimal is great, but optimal means nothing if you can't do that.
Right. Yeah, so definitely a great point to make. And so I wanted to also move into a word that gets thrown a lot around in like the nutrition space is glycemic index. So, and some people will say low glycemic index foods are better, high glycemic index foods are worse. Sometimes in very specific situations, I will encourage people to go low glycemic index. Maybe it's because they just got their blood work done and they are like pre-diabetic. And in those situations, it's definitely nuanced. However, I wanted to just kind of define what glycemic index is. So glycemic index is a score that has been like placed on food in the literature for how much of an effect a specific type of carbohydrate has on blood sugar. So for example, we have a low glycemic index carbohydrate like broccoli will have a much lower impact on increasing blood glucose than say something like white rice. And so we can definitely maybe do like a different podcast on that specific topic, which I feel like would be weird if we wanted to, but I didn't want to go into too deep of context on that because I really just want to talk about what people care about, like how do we use this as income?
Yeah, but that's a really common word, and people do hear that and they're like, okay, well, what should I do? So first of all, the glycemic
or what
index,
carbs are good and bad, and I think people will use the glycemic index to be like, oh, these are good carbs, these are bad carbs, simple versus complex. That's kind of, that falls under that umbrella. Which
to a large degree, that's a oversimplification, but it's useful, right? It's a useful oversimplification. If you're going to pick something, when in doubt, most people should probably be picking the low to moderate glycemic index carbs versus the high glycemic carbs. But obviously stuff like, you know, we talked about rice earlier. Rice is going to be a higher glycemic carb, and depending, but most of the time that's looked at only just the carbs, right? Like they're not pairing that with a meal. So like if you're having protein, that will slow down the index anyways. So it's not to say that these things are good or bad. We're just not trying to have these like insane insulin spikes all throughout the day, just kind of like haphazardly. If you are going to train, maybe it makes sense if you're like, man, I'm kind of dragging right now and like I didn't really eat as much earlier. Have like a bowl of cereal or something like that, right? Like something that's like, okay, easy in and out and not going to impede your training. But if it's, 4 p.m. and you're not training that day, maybe you don't need 60 carbs from mostly sugar, right? Like it's just going to depend on the situation.
That's why we typically recommend like having those higher glycemic carbs around training because that spike in insulin is a trigger for an anabolic pathway. So it's definitely helpful for building muscle and all of those things. So
it's a funky one too because people, there's so much misinformation about like, no, eat so much fruit, it's like the healthiest thing ever. And then there's also people who are like, no, don't eat fruit, it's full of sugar. And so if you're eating fruit in its whole form, it's going to have fiber, which is also, again, going to impact the digestion. It's going to slow it down. And we already talked about fiber is incredibly important. And the micronutrients in fruit are so like vital for you. So sure, again, in a healthy context, are we eating like only fruit? Like maybe not, right? But, and certain people are going to have to moderate how much they have based on their certain goals. If you go to like Jamba Juice or whatever, right, and you get like a 300 carb smoothie, it's all fruit, you're like, okay, but maybe that wasn't appropriate for your goals.
Your blood sugar is going to be through the roof.
And they probably added like juice and frozen yogurt and whatever, right? So it's not just like you had a banana and an apple. Like it's very different. It's very compact. Now, am I going to say don't go have that ever? Like no. But it's all about understanding kind of like what you need. And as you guys know, if you've listened to any of our other shows or follow or any of our other content, like we actively try not to be like put things in like a good or bad like camp. It's all about context and for somebody who's training for a jiu-jitsu tournament or a CrossFit event, like that's going to be very different than somebody who is pretty sedentary outside of like a walk to their car in the office. Like that's going to be a very different diet just because of what the person needs.
Absolutely. And so the last two macronutrient metabolism episodes, I included at least like one study. So I thought that it would be cool to include a study that looked at different glycemic index diets. So a study that looked at 3 different diets. One was a high glycemic diet, one was a low glycemic diet, and one was a high-fat diet, found that all groups lost weight and improved insulin sensitivity independent of diet composition. So what mattered most in that context was the calorie deficit. So therefore, lowering glycemic index didn't improve any added benefit to energy restriction when it came to weight loss. full disclosure, this was a study done in obese individuals. Might it be a different story in leaner individuals? Most weight loss studies are done in obese individuals, but maybe that is a study we can do in Campbell's lab. Campbell, if you are listening to this, would be really cool. And then I also wanted to talk about sugar, because I feel like that is, another like tabloid topic. Like, is sugar bad for you? Can you answer that question?
I mean, again, context. No. Why? Here's the context.
Yeah.
So, of course, we already talked about a little bit, having mismanaged blood glucose or having these rapid insulin spikes, like at all these different periods of time, like, can that cause issues over time? Yes. We do not want that to be happening, right? For a lot of other reasons. Just look up type 2 diabetes to see what we're talking about.
Insulin insensitivity after chronically being overfed with carbohydrates.
Yes. But typically what's going to happen in that context is you're going to be overfed, not just with carbohydrates, but typically overfed with fats as well. You're going to be just overfed in general, meaning you have too high of calories. You may not be resistance training. You may not be eating enough protein. Right? Like, there's all these other things. Maybe you're not sleeping. Maybe you're not, like,
I'm not sleeping.
A million things, right? So there's going to be context as always, everything. So is sugar bad for you? No. Is excess added sugar without any other restraint in your diet maybe not the best? Yeah. We would not suggest that at all.
Yeah.
But all carbohydrates get broken down into sugars, like Karina talked about in the beginning. All carbs that you eat. I don't care if you're eating, celery, which is not a negative calorie food, but that was a bad example. Broccoli.
Yeah, it's going to get broken down into glucose.
It's going to be broken down into sugars.
Yeah.
So I hate when people say that, and I understand what they're talking about, but it's like, just say the word added sugar, right? Or whatever. Like, just make that distinguish, because there is a big difference of, carbohydrates versus just talking about added sugars, because what kind of carbs are we talking about here? Potatoes, broccoli, or, frosted flakes, right? Like, these are totally different conversations.
Different carbs are, like we said earlier, are going to have different impacts on blood glucose, which...
Are you having protein with this? Are you having fats with this?
Yeah.
What else did you eat?
They're all going to eventually get broken down into glucose for your body to use later on. Some points I have here is, like, sugar is only bad in chronically high amounts. We recommend all the time, have things like that in moderation. Super high intakes are linked to obesity and chronic disease, like we said. Too much of anything is not good for you, and then also can indirectly be linked to nutrient deficiencies, because it's often just a bunch of empty calories that you're not getting those micronutrients from.
Yeah, if you're drinking 2 sodas a day.
Hey.
Yeah. We need to have a talk, because that is just, full of nothing important. And I understand people like that taste, but, like, I know people who switch to diet and it's fine. Or if you're gonna have one, have it, like, every once in a while, right? Like, it's not that it's necessarily a problem, but if you're just drinking, most people are drinking soda and sitting down. They're not, like, drinking soda and, like, going to train. You know what I mean? Like, it's not normally, like, a paired up type of a thing. Yeah. No, not to say that somebody who drinks soda doesn't exercise, but we're talking about, like, in that context, like, you're okay, let me just have a soda right now, and then maybe I'll do something later. It's just, there's a lot of ways that you can look at this. So limiting, maybe the better way to look at it is, all right, like, do I need to have a bunch of added sugars in my diet? Probably not. If you're asking that question, you probably don't. If you're, like, an athlete, different discussion, right?
Yeah.
But there really is no need for excess carbohydrate intake if you are not training.
Yeah. If you're not someone who is, like, going through, like, multiple hours of, like, long, hard training, then I think of endurance athletes, for example. Those are the people who are literally just, like, slurping up gels of straight glucose because their body is constantly going into a deficit of that and they need it to actually perform. Whereas someone who, is a bit more sedentary, or maybe just, like, goes to the gym 3 times a week just to maintain their health, which is great, that person probably doesn't need all those added sugars.
It doesn't mean that you also need no carbs, right? Like, we're not suggesting having a no carb diet either, because there are many drawbacks with that for the physiology as far as, like, digestion and gut health and all of that, but also just adherence is not going to happen, and total calories are going to be more important. So if we're able to maintain total calorie balance while eating carbohydrates, that is key, versus saying, like, no, don't have it at all. Like, that's easy for a short term, but as we've seen in the long term, it doesn't seem to be very successful for most people. Like, and actually the research really has shown it to be pretty equivocal. Like, of course, certain disease states like epilepsy, like keto is going to be superior. But for like, just if we're talking about calorie balance and, you know, obesity and all this type of stuff, if you're in the calorie range, doesn't really seem to be that much better.
Yeah, there's a study that we went over in Dr. Campbell's class. It was a really cool study. It was longitudinal. They followed these people around for a year. It consisted of like either 200 or 600. It's one of those numbers, which both are still a lot. 200 people who they followed for a year. 200
plus.
200 plus, which they divided into 3 different groups: low fat diet, low carb diet, and then the control group, which I think was just like a balance of both. All 3 groups lost weight. So as long as you're in a calorie deficit. Okay, so now the fun part. How, and this is where I'll let you kind of take more of the lead. So how do we use carbs to manipulate body fat for the physique athlete? Which I know is a loaded question, but maybe like just start somewhere and we can.
We'll start somewhere and just break it down. So first we have to look at so if a physique athlete is going to obviously be in a position where they are in an extended calorie deficit to be at extreme low levels of body fat. But before we ever start that diet, we need to work somebody's intake up. Oftentimes you might hear this defined as like a reverse diet, where we're bringing food up, probably above maintenance. We're going to be in likely a surplus if you're actually trying to actively gain muscle. In that time, I would say that it is going to be a very carbohydrate heavy diet, because we are trying, again, to utilize things as we can with the insulin spikes in a good way, right, for muscle building.
So at that point, it's more like also performance enhancement.
Yes.
Because in the off season, you're trying to build muscle, which you need to train very
and
hard.
recover.
And that's where those carbs are going to be super important. And then this will segue very nicely into performance.
Yeah, so physique athletes, performance does matter. I don't care what anybody says, like, it is important. Now, the way that you train and the way that you implement things is going to be different, but training is incredibly important. And most people who are competing need more muscle, like most people. There are the freaks who barely train and they just to fit into their category, but most people need to train more. So in an off season, food is going to be higher. Also, we've talked about this before too, but like, you don't want to start a diet in a low place. You want to start as high as you comfortably can, and then cut down, because if you're starting at like 1,500 calories, well, good luck prepping. It's going to be a nightmare. Now, everybody, I hate using numbers because there are some people who just simply can't eat a lot of food.
Yeah.
That's the reality. But for most people, if they're training hard, we can work their calories up. So we're going to have their carbs pretty high. And for, again, most, not all, because I've worked with a ton of different diet composition clients over the years, most people are going to thrive on a higher carb, more low to moderate fat for physique purposes. So we are going to manipulate carbs though a lot, because remember, we're starting pretty high, or we should be, and that is really going to be the main thing that we're manipulating to diet. I will drop fat, of course, but that range is a lot smaller, because I never really take it super high with people in an off season, because when you pair carbs and fats together high, you're going to just gain body fat. That is literally like asking to gain a lot of body fat. So if your carbs are high, you have to watch your fat intake. Take it from experience. When you bring your fats up pretty high and your carbs, it is a disaster. Like, metabolically, you're not as healthy, and also like you just do not look good. So you kind of have to pick one or the other. And when you're in a surplus, it's going to be really hard to have like a surplus of fats, right? Like, it's a much better maintenance lifestyle. Anyways, we're not talking about that. So we're going to have a smaller window or range for fats, and protein doesn't really change that much. We only change protein later on when somebody's body weight has like dramatically dropped, and we either need to just cut calories somewhere, or they're just not metabolizing it as well. But in any case, carbs are going to be the biggest thing that are changing. That's what we're fluctuating for refeeds or diet breaks, or hey, we need to get really aggressive this week, we're going to drop some carbs. And that is the main thing that we're manipulating throughout the diet, and especially for a physique athlete during peak week. So I would say that, carbs are really like the heavy hitter as far as like what we're changing and manipulating, because protein, in an off season, we might build it up a little bit, and then also in a diet, we might bring it down a little bit. And then fats, I'm going to kind of try to stick within a certain range. Don't really like going too high or too low with them, for hormonal and metabolic reasons.
Yeah, so I would say, especially for fat loss, the adjustment of carbohydrates out of the gate is going to be super important. So if we go back to the fat metabolism podcast, carbohydrates have the most significant impact on insulin. And if you remember from that podcast, insulin plays kind of a gatekeeper to lipolysis, or that beginning process of fat burning. So lipolysis is the breakdown of fat. If insulin levels are too high, it's going to inhibit lipolysis at all. So that's why typically when I start someone on a diet, carbs are always the first one to go, or first one to be reduced. Not completely go, obviously.
Zero.
Yeah, we want to bring insulin levels a little bit downward so we can really start circulating all those other hormones that will say, hey, like insulin levels are low, let's start moving and mobilizing fats for energy. And so I think that was a really good kind of overall overview. On how we would manipulate carbohydrates for the physique athlete. So now moving toward the performance athlete. It's going to be a different game, simply because when we look at the physique athlete, there are kind of two main phases, right? So there is that building phase where carbohydrates are super important for performance, and then there is the body recomposition phase, and that's going to be our main focus, where we might decrease carbs to really simply focus on decreasing body fat, maintaining muscle mass, and playing with those 3 macronutrients with the objective of changing body composition. But when we're looking at performance athletes, all we care is about their performance. We care about how strong they are, their power output, how fast they are, and making sure that they're eating enough to keep a performance level high enough. And so that's also going to come into play with, okay, what is the intensity of their sport? Like, are they a powerlifter? Are they a CrossFitter? Are they a runner? And the carbohydrate needs and recommendations for each of those are going to be very different. And so also referring back to the Fat Metabolism podcast, we talked about specific thresholds in VO2 max where fuels are going to be different. So for carbohydrates, any intensities of exercise that are over 60% of your VO2 max are going to be too much or too hard for your body to rely on fats, because fat oxidation is a slower process, and that quick carb oxidation and making sure that you're able to get that glucose quickly to the muscle and perform. So at higher intensities, carbohydrates are going to be much more or much better. That's why you have a lot of runners typically on higher carb diets, because they need that very quickly. Whereas the strength athlete, we definitely want them to have a high carb diet, but it's maybe not going to be as high as an endurance athlete. Because more so for the strength athlete, I would say carbs are obviously for producing some energy, also recovery and things like that. And so for the performance athlete, we want to make sure that their meal before they train is going to be supplying them with enough energy. So I typically like to recommend highest carbohydrate meals are pre and post workout. And then if you have a really long training session, also make sure that some percentage of those are intra-workout as well, so that you have that energy nice and quick, especially when you're prepping as well. So going back to the physique athlete and the performance within that specific niche, like, it's really sad when I have to drink my carbs and I'm like super thirsty or super hungry, but it makes a difference to like really push me through the end of that training when I'm in a deficit.
It makes a huge difference. So I think that, like I said, when I started talking about the physique athlete, people really undervalue the performance aspect, right? And this is something
you need to perform to look good.
Yeah, you have to perform in the gym. Like, unless you are just this, genetic freak who has all of this muscle mass and you can just hammer your diet and hammer your cardio and hold on to your muscle, cool. But most people are not going to be in that situation.
Yeah, that's why bodybuilding is so hard, because there's two components. Like, there is that, and I think of coaching as like a science and also an art. Like, are you able to make sure that this person has enough food to train hard, but also make sure you run that fine line well enough to make sure that they're also losing body fat at the same time. So.
No, it's like a very complex process. But oftentimes when I care most about somebody using intra-workout carbs when they are dieting, which sounds so counterintuitive, because that's the time where you're like, okay, wait, we're dropping carbs as a total and I'm hungry and you want me to drink 10 grams of carbs? Hard no. And I'm like,
that's like 3 bags of lettuce.
And I'm like, listen, I know this sucks.
I could be eating like a bowl of watermelon instead.
But I've done it both ways, and I've had many clients now, and they talk about maintaining their strength a lot better, which is a good indirect measure of just kind of like the muscle that you're keeping. I know it's not a perfect measurement, but it's a decent measurement. And they all report the same thing, which is exactly what I've reported too. You just are able to finish that workout with a little bit of that, like that edge. And whereas when you are in a glycogen depleted state, because you are losing body fat, and I don't care who you are, you have to deplete your glycogen in order to lose body fat. Like you're going to be in a depleted state when you're in a bodybuilding
because like we said, glycogen is that storage form of carbohydrate. Your muscle needs to break apart that glycogen to get that glucose to use for energy. So you're going to be depleted over time.
So when people are always trying to stay like super full and like all pumped up, it's like that's great, but like you're going to have to be very flat in order to lose body fat. Like it's just the way that it works. Anybody who's prepped knows what I'm talking about. You feel like a fucking pool noodle like all day, and you're just like, okay, do I need to lift? And you're just like Squidward. That's basically what you feel like at all times. But that like end of the session, like you just kind of fizzle out because you're just depleted. So by timing the carbs, and that's really too when it's a really good time to use pre-workout also. And we're not, clearly I love caffeine. I'm a big proponent of caffeine, within reason, right? People can just slam it. But I think people have gotten a lot smarter with it, like in recent years. But people are like, oh, I don't know if I want to use it. I'm like, no, this is the time to use it. Like you don't have the calories, you know what I mean? You don't have the recovery. Like this is the perfect time. Use your pre-workout like before and then have the intra during, and now you're going to preserve this session in a much better way. And you're going to be able to keep the muscle that you've worked so hard in that off season for. And that's where those little details really matter.
Burn a little bit more calories because you're able to train harder.
Exactly. That's the whole benefit of, and this is again another tangent, but when we use refeeds, the data isn't like outstanding either way. It's not like, oh my God, they're the best thing ever, but they're also not the worst thing ever. So you have to look at it, okay, if it's pretty negligible, like in a positive or negative direction, let's see how this works for the client.
If it doesn't hurt, let's try it.
And for most people, what it does is it gives them the extra boost so that they can perform better for at least a day, at least a session, right? Now, I will say that it doesn't work for every client. Some clients really struggle with the mental aspect of the refeed, and it's harder for them afterwards, like giving their body a little bit of food, they're
like, oh, I wish I had 10 more.
Hunger is out of control. It's just, it's counterproductive. So for some people, we don't use them. And for some people, it's like, hey, it's a calorie game. Like, we don't have enough calories for this right now. But the real benefit of the refeed is having that extra, little bit of glycogen so that you can train better, at least for a day, or at least feel, more energized for that day. And you're not just like, oh, I'm going to get my training session done and then just sit all day. Sorry, side tangent.
You're good. So that's kind of, we've hit all 3 points. Maybe like baseline foundation of carbohydrates in general, manipulation for physique athletes, and then performance athletes. Is there anything you think we left out?
I want to touch a little bit on the performance athletes side, because there are certain sports that it is a weight cut sport or a weight class sport. So the debate of like, do you cut weight, do you not, should you train at the weight?
Jiu-jitsu, do you have to make a weight class? Okay, that makes sense.
So it's a weight class sport.
I know nothing about jiu-jitsu, I'm sorry.
Most people don't. It depends obviously on the organization. It depends on how competitive it is. Some of them have really wide ranges of like what is like the top end, right? And then but yes, there are weight ranges there, which makes sense because obviously now if it's a really small tournament and there's only like, there's obviously not as many girls who do jiu-jitsu, so if there's not a lot of people, like you might be going against somebody who's way bigger or way smaller, which is way harder in something like jiu-jitsu, because if somebody's smaller than me, their game is way different than mine. Like they are faster, they're more flexible, they're just kind of like wiggly.
Wiggly.
Whereas if somebody's bigger, they're going to have more of that like power, strength, and they're going to be able to hold people better. So like that's kind of more what I rely on. So when I'm with somebody who's really small, I'm like that's just not what I do. Like I'm not fast, I'm not quick, I'm not super flexible. Like I can.
And bikini girl strength.
So jacked. But so something for something like jiu-jitsu, and I just worked with a client who just competed yesterday. To make weight. So that was a situation where, I have several clients who do that and they have to make weight. So for them, it depends on the competition, but some competitions are 24-hour weigh-ins and some are 2-hour weigh-ins, right? So that's going to vastly differ too. If you have a 2-hour weigh-in you can't expect to drop 20 pounds and then compete like that. That's going to be awful. If you have 24 hours or like whatever, half a day, you can gain that weight back and you're fine. So if you only have a short weigh-in, it might make more sense to be around that weight and then just manipulate the last few pounds. Versus if you have a full day, like when Ryan competes, he'll lose 30 pounds and he gains 30 pounds back, right? Like it's super.
Obviously it's relative because he's such a big guy.
But he like is about to die, but he has the 24 hours and he gets 2 IVs and then he's like just it's a whole thing. So but that's part of what you do. It just depends on the sport, and it depends too like what I always tell people in performance weight sports is if you can't gain that weight back, do not cut it. Because if you, again, so for me, I'm like 160. If I were to cut down to 145, right, which would be a substantial cut. Say I manipulated that with like food, water, sweating, whatever. And then I have 2 hours. My body's used to being at 160. I'm not going to be able to recover that. But if I had a whole day or even 12 hours, I could easily get right back up to 160. So if it's going to be something like that, you need to be closer. And then you also have to think too, if it's something like, powerlifting, you can be pretty bloated. Like that's the whole point. Like you need to be bloated, you need to be strong. If I'm doing jiu-jitsu or you're running around at fucking 100 degrees doing CrossFit, you're not trying to like gain 30 pounds in a day and feel really bloated, right? Like that's going to be a nightmare, which obviously CrossFit's not a weight sport, but you know what I'm talking about. Like that, you have to look at the sport. Am I rolling around with somebody? Are they like putting their knee on my stomach? Like, that's a positional thing.
Or is it like 45 minutes of straight, like high intensity intervals?
So it's like, okay, we really need to, we can as a performance athlete get a little bit closer to that weight if that's going to be ideal for you, and then just adjust. So it's really going to depend on the sport. But as far as carbs go, yes, carbs equal performance. We'll just say carbs equal performance. You heard it here first. Really great equation. Carbs equal performance.
Like I am an advocate for I've done ketogenic diet research, and I think it can do really amazing things in like the clinical setting.
100%.
Like so very cool. But I would say for like this niche of sports athletes, physique athletes, you want to use carbs to your advantage for sure.
There will always be outliers, but generally speaking, it's the tried and true way to get the best results. And it's what we're going to manipulate for both physique and performance athletes. So thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. This finishes out our carb, protein, and fat metabolism series.
Macros. Now for the macros. Just kidding. It's gonna be so boring.
I'm like falling asleep. We do have a really great article though that just came out on the website about kind of hydration and electrolytes. So check that out. Plug. We do have a newsletter every week that goes out. Karina writes a Metcon Monday, so you get a free Metcon to your email inbox on Sunday night, so you can do it for the week, and then on Wednesdays we have an educational article. So if you want to subscribe to the newsletter, or you want to apply for coaching, or just send us an email, you can visit teamlocofit.com, and we'll talk to you guys next week. Bye!